Hey y'all, here at OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a quick look at the Plimpton P8 Pro PlimPad. It's another low-cost Android tablet, this one here retailing for under 80 bucks. And although far from a mainstream brand, Plimpton is a company that we have seen make other Android tablets in the past, and they've performed all right, but again, this is their most budget-oriented model to date. Taking a closer look at some of the system specs, it does have a aluminum metal alloy shell, which is kind of impressive, I'd say, for a sub $80 tablet, considering most of those alternatives from Amazon Fire devices are made entirely out of plastic. It's running on Android 13 and it has an Octa-Core processor. It's the all-winner A528. Now, this is a chip that is a little bit weaker in benchmarks compared to something like a MediaTek G99, so don't expect it to be lightning fast, but should be all right for the basics. Has a 2-megapixel front-facing webcam and a 5-megapixel rear-facing camera, stereo speakers, and wide-fine L1 cert, meaning that it can play back full HD resolution videos on Netflix. That being said, the screen, like many other budget tablets that we've seen lately, seems to be just HD plus res. It does have dual band Wi-Fi, and in terms of RAM, there's 4 gigabytes built on in. Again, pretty competitive for a tablet in this price. However, there's additional 4 gigabytes of virtual RAM that it supports. Although not exactly the same thing as the actual RAM, it does help the multitasking performance a bit, and still kind of impressive to see on a tablet which is so cheap. There's 128 gigabytes of built-in system storage as well, plentiful for this price range, expandable via a micro SD card up to 1 TB. And the 6,000 milliamp hour capacity battery is rated for around 10 to 11 hours of web browsing before it has to be recharged again. Now, what I will say is that as compared to one of the recent tablets we checked out, being the Umidigi G3 Tab Pro, that one has cellular capabilities, whereas the Plimpton is a Wi-Fi only model, but that's kind of expected again for a sub $80 tablet. There is no case or folio included in the packaging though. We have just the basics, including a user guide, actually pretty well documented there in full color, and the charging cable using USB Type-C with some of the specs that are printed on the side. It takes around 2.5 to 3 hours to fully recharge back up. So here's a closer look at the design of the P8 Pro, which I have to say is definitely more premium looking than the price would imply. Bezels aren't the thinnest we've ever seen on the tablet, but it is actually quite reasonable with 2.5D glass that is actually feeling quite smooth as you're interacting with the UI. And again, the frame of the tablet is actually constructed out of aluminum alloy. So it actually has a pretty premium feel as you're holding onto the metal here on the back. Has a bit of weight to it as well, and on the back we do have a 5-megapixel single camera with an LED flash. Right-hand spine, you'll find access to the micro SD card slot for expanding the built-in memory, USB Type-C for, again, providing power and data transfer, nothing else on the other side. Very top features the 3.5mm headphone jack, which is actually, interestingly, almost on the very edge of the tablet, but still works. And there's also the volume rocker, as well as the power key, which are all made out of metal and feel pretty tactile and responsive. The very bottom here features the stereo speakers that gives you a bit of separation on the left and the right sides. On the front here, we do have the aforementioned webcam, and out of the box, the P8 Pro does have a factory pre-applied screen protector as well that provides some additional scratch resistance to the display. Now, speaking of this screen, for an HD plus res panel, I would say that it looks decent as far as colors are concerned. Of course, if you are looking super closely, you can still notice some pixelation if you are doing that level of pixel peeping as expected on a larger display like this, but just for doing basic things like web browsing, it does all right. That being said, for 10-inch tablets and above, I would really like to see full HD resolution as a minimum going forwards, even on less expensive tablets. Though, one advantage here, as we've touched on in the past, is there are fewer pixels for the CPU and GPU to push around, especially on a lower-end chipset like this, so it still remains a little bit more snappy as a result. That being said, some of the animations seem to be purposefully limited on the ROM here from Plimpton's side to make it feel a little bit more snappy with a, again, less performant processor on board. That being said, the software version is extremely clean. Aside from the standard Google apps, there is really just the Play Store, and that is mostly it. You get some standard utility tools from Android, as well as a basic built-in sound recorder for taking memos with the microphone. And interestingly enough, there is also Netflix pre-installed because of the Widewine L1 cert. That being said, you can always uninstall this if you aren't using this particular streaming service. Otherwise, the display seems reasonable in terms of viewing angles. That being said, it isn't a fully laminated panel, so that's another area where slight costs were cut. So there is a ever so slight gap between the glass and the LCD underneath, which can add a little bit to the glare of the screen. It's a bit of a glossy panel, so fingerprints do also show up, so you have to kind of wipe it down after a while, but for the most part, I'd say it is a decent enough quality screen for this price range. And taking a closer look at system settings, if we jump into memory expansion, this is where you can add up to 4 additional virtual RAM for better multitasking performance. The system will then reboot. And also interestingly, you have kind of a customized layout for the virtual navigation buttons on the bottom. Aside from just the standard home, back, and multitasking, you also get volume controls in addition to a screenshot key in the built-in menu down below. That being said, you can also turn this into the regular gesture navigation method if preferred, though to, again, reduce the number of animations that the tablet has to push with its more limited GPU, I would say that the button navigation method tends to work a little bit more smoothly. Similarly, there are shortcuts built in by Plimpton for things like screenshot by sliding down with your fingers, and you're also able to set up a timer function, which is interesting, allowing you to automate whenever the tablet turns on and off by itself. For example, at a certain time of day, if you're trying to check the news in the morning, and then you can turn it off if you're not returning to the tablet until later in the evening. Aside from that, though, everything else is pretty much faithful to stock Android, including customizing what the power key, if you're long pressing, can correspond to, double click and trigger the camera. Some occasional firmware updates will also become available to improve on the system's stability. That being said, like most other budget-oriented tablets, I don't really anticipate having too many OS level upgrades past the Android 13 OS. So that is one thing to keep in mind if you're looking at a lower cost unit like this, which hopefully we'll continue to see improvements on down the road. You can also change the color temperature on the display, go into a reading mode that makes it a little bit more yellow in its color and appearance, as well as a color enhance mode that can make it more contrast rich, saturation rich if you're watching back videos, for instance. And last but not least, you are able to set up, again, face recognition using the front camera if you want to unlock the tablet, although there is no biometric fingerprint scanner on this unit, though you can also use a password or PIN if desired. Overall takeaway would being that the speakers are actually quite decent. It doesn't sound too tinny or shrill at the higher volume levels, and the stereo separation on this particular tablet also works quite well. As you're holding it, it seems pretty immersive, but you can also use wireless Bluetooth headphones, speakers, or wired ones if you prefer. Again, the display, if you are mostly using it indoors, it still seems alright as long as you aren't really pixel peeping, that is, especially with some of the more contrast-rich display modes, also seeming to work a little bit better than expected. That being said, if you want the sharpest resolution screen, you're obviously not going to get that out of a ultra low-cost tablet like this. For the most part, reception quality also seems to be average, and I was able to load back videos really without waiting too long, as you can tell here, for things like scrubbing, and I was getting around 3 if not full bars for dual band Wi-Fi. So things like watching back videos, it seems that the Allwinner processor is still able to handle without having too many issues, including a picture-in-picture mode as well. Ultimately, this is running on a full version of, again, Android 13, as opposed to something like the Lite or Go edition of the operating system. It is also using the standard Gboard keyboard that supports swipe as well, or voice input, and here's also a quick example of what browsing feels like using the Chrome browser here. We are loading up the full desktop version of the site, so a little bit more complex with additional videos and ads, scrolling elements on the site here, but for the most part, it seems to be doing a satisfactory job. You do have to wait for a few seconds longer compared to more powerful tablets. Even the G99 powered chips that we have seen on some of the recent offerings seem to be just a hair faster than this one, as you can tell there. But that's reasonable, I'd say, considering those tablets usually retail for around 140 to 150 bucks, so about twice the amount that this particular model goes for. And for the most part, I would say that you're not getting necessarily twice the performance on those models. Sure, on here you have to wait a little bit longer, be just a bit more patient, but once the pages do load up, pinch to zoom feels smooth enough, and you can still get some decent web browsing work done on this tablet. The multitasking view is also split in a slightly more interesting way compared to other tablets I've seen lately. It puts the most recent app as the largest icon and everything else in a slightly smaller view, and you're able to also see how much RAM it's being occupied, as well as go into a split-screen multitasking view by clicking on a second app that you want to share the screen with. And taking a closer look at the camera performance next, jumping into that, as aforementioned, in a tablet, I don't expect the camera to be quite as competitive as on a smartphone. As long as it's good enough for scanning in documents, I'm content, and that is the case here. The UI is quite basic, but you have the ability to toggle on HDR, as well as change the aspect ratio of the photo. There's a 2x digital crop, but again, no ultra-wide angle or telephoto zoom lens, anything crazy like that on an entry-level device like this, but it does the basics well. There are a few filters that you can play around with, as well as stickers, turning on the flash, as well as changing the resolution of the photos as well. And video can be captured up to 720p HD res, which is, I think, fitting as well, since that's the maximum that the screen can show anyways. Last but not least, you'll also find some, again, beauty effects for things like selfies if you want to smoothen out the skin, but there is no additional Pro Mode controls, nor does this particular model have any AI or HDR capabilities on that camera. Just for simple scanning in of documents, here's a quick example of what that looks like. It seems to do all right, as long as there's sufficient lighting around you. And here's another example here as well. So okay for a tablet camera, that is. Don't expect anything extraordinary, but for things like quick video calls or again for text, it will suffice. And as far as doing a little bit of gaming here and there is concerned, I would say you have to keep it very casual on this particular model, especially with CPU and GPU not being particularly strong. But for more kind of tap and go style games, things like Stack, for example, puzzle type games, trivia games, you should be all right. Slightly heavier games and titles can also be installed since there is enough storage space on here, but for things like loading, you have to expect it to be just a little bit slower to open them back up, and also you have to really lower the graphics settings if you are playing anything a little bit more demanding. So not a great choice if you're doing, again, more exhaustive gaming, but if you're keeping things very casual, you should still find it to be a satisfactory enough experience, I would say. A little bit better than I expected, to be honest, for something so low cost. That being said, the tablet does get a little bit warm on the left-hand corner region here when you are gaming for longer than, say, 20 or 30 minutes. So the chip here is not the most thermally efficient in the world. You can definitely use this, though, to read back any PDFs, webtoons, and comics, and it seems to do all right for those purposes as well, as you can tell. Especially in most indoor conditions, it still seems to be fair enough for those basic tasks. So that is more or less it as far as our quick hands-on review of, again, the Plimpton P8 Pro. And despite, again, that Pro name at the end, it's a kind of tactic we've seen a few times now on some of these less expensive tablets. This is really not a ultra high-end model. Quite the opposite, in fact. It is a good example of what you can expect for a ultra budget tablet here in 2024. You also get a little bit more RAM as well as storage space than we typically see on a model like this. And so if you're just keeping things very light for web browsing, for example, as well as watching back some occasional videos, it seems to fare decently. Although it's far from being perfect, I would argue that it's a better value than many of the Amazon Fire tablets you can find, because the, for example, Fire 11 tablet has a similar metal construction. It has a slightly more powerful CPU, yes, but at the end of the day, it's also about 2 to 3 times more expensive. So this gets you a very similar experience without having to shell out quite as much, and a cleaner version of Android as well. So if you don't need lightning fast performance 24/7, just for the casual basics, it actually is a pretty good ultra low cost tablet, I'd say. You can learn more details if you're interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Plimpton P8 Pro 10-inch Android tablet.